Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel on embracing today's uncertainty, how to govern towards future outcomes. The panel is part of a government aftershock event, which intends to explore the implication of the crisis for governments and the future of government beyond the crisis. This event is largely an OECD experiment to bring together local conversation with the perspective of government leaders. We had already more than 65 events around the globe yesterday. So what is the focus of today's discussion? 20th century governments have been designed to work in predictable environments where behaviors are expected, routines established, and knowledge bases available. The COVID-19 pandemic reminds us that this stability is fictional and the future can be highly uncertain. And against this, government cannot stand still or pause. The cost of late action or inaction can be terribly high. Government needs to be ready to embrace uncertainty, but the question is how. I'm very proud to introduce the panelists who are with us today to answer these and other questions on how we can manage uncertainty toward positive outcomes. Let me introduce who the panelists are. Darja Isaksson, Director General at Vinnova, Sweden's innovation agency. Aaron Maniam, Deputy Secretary of Industry and Information at the Ministry of Communications and Information in Singapore. Welcome, Aaron and Darja. And Olli-Pekka Einonen, Director General at the National Agency for Education in Finland. Welcome, Olli, and welcome to all of you. Thanks very much to be with us. Before we start, I want to remind everyone of some of the background information about the sessions and how you can provide input through the conference messaging function that you find on the top right of your screen. Now, to get started, let me put up a question to all of you that should appear as a poll again on the up and side of your screen. Which of these describe best your view on the role of your government in facing uncertainties? First one, my government should be in the lead role, actively shaping changes as they happen, despite the unknowns or risks, and acting before the chips fall. My government should act as soon as it has a sufficient evidence about the situation and the possible outcomes of these actions. Or my government should provide stability in time of crisis, given the critical role it serves, and take action where there is more certainty. So please let us know what you think. We will get back to the results later on the day and get reactions from our panelists. Now, I would like to turn to each of our panelists and ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves and share a little about what has been your experience with dealing with uncertainty brought by the crisis. So I'll turn first to Darja. Over to you.
Oh, thank you. I'll start with one reflection. If we learn anything from the pandemic we're currently living through, it's that the challenges of our time are global, complex, and deeply systemic in nature. This is the time to really acknowledge we're all part of a system that's perfectly designed for the outcomes we're currently getting. Serious vulnerabilities in anything from how we set up global value chains to how we manage resources, be it food or biodiversity, planetary resources. And even a lockdown of big parts of society during this time has resulted in a mere blip on the radar of our global carbon emissions. So we need to remember we're facing hard deadlines now, set by planetary boundaries who care little for our risk appetite or willingness to invest. We are already in what climate scientists call the decisive decade, the make it or break it decade. This is our window of opportunity to set human society on a path that will allow our children to prosper in a world that's better than ours. The alternative will be abysmal. Let's get back to that. But so therefore, we must admit that the biggest risk to us all is one that is solidly based on evidence, doing too little too late. So right now we see governments all over the world investing in response to the pandemic, and that needs to be made as wise investments. We need to use them to transform entire systems: production, mobility, energy, food, education, and health. And all of these transformations cut across policy areas. They need to be dealt with across policy areas. This is a political capability risk that requires leadership. So that means that we see in different responses varying ability to prepare rather than react, using scenario planning tools, for instance, various efforts to an extent to have a whole of government approach, which requires leadership, shifting culture, behavior, and work practices. And we see also some examples of attempting to invest in the future by taking this opportunity now to shape markets, create opportunities for transformation in response to the COVID. Each of these transformations will depend on our ability to quickly adopt key enabling technologies that are already available to us, although not always mature or applied in ways that provide the outcomes that we need. And this is an innovation capability risk. They're not solving our problems quickly enough. So to improve that situation, we also see some efforts made in creating directionality, providing clear vision that enables autonomy and mobilizing towards common goals. We see efforts allowing risk-managed experimentation for learning and failure between each other. And we also see investments in the necessary research and innovation in various countries, but also in the infrastructure needed, particularly digital infrastructure. So to summarize, I would also like to point out that it's interesting to note that the pandemic in itself is a good example of the power of shared missions. Because in the response to this pandemic, and the goal of saving lives and beating the virus, we have seen prioritizations as well as changes in behavior all over the world on an individual, organizational, and national level. So I think that we have a lot of things to benefit from taking those lessons learned and turn this crisis into an opportunity to accelerate transformation, which, by the way, also represent the biggest opportunity for value creation since the first industrial revolution.
Thanks, Daria. And I'll pick on your motto: prepare, not react, which is, I think, it's a very good line for the whole panel. Now, over to Harun. What is your experience of facing uncertainty, in particular with this crisis?
Thanks very much, Marco, for the kind invite to join you today. I wanted to share kind of three initial points, to start us off. The first, which comes out of being in the pandemic, is really that I think the idea of normal has truly been shown to be a myth. We talk about going to a new normal, but what does that mean, really? I don't think we're going to move from one stable equilibrium to another. I think we might need to start abandoning the idea of normality entirely. Some people say that maybe there'll be a next normal, just one normal out of many successive normals. But even that, I think, is a bit of an illusion. We kid ourselves that there will be that sort of order. But actually, I think what we are going to have is not a new normal or a next normal, but a never normal situation, right? A situation of continuous fluidity and flux and turbulence, where we will continually, therefore, have to adjust. In terms of the crisis itself, I've been struck by the language that we use to describe it. And I remember giving a talk about this a few months ago, because a lot of people are talking about the war on the pandemic, right? The war on the virus. We talk about flattening the curve and defeating the virus. But who actually is the enemy in this whole virus? I think the idea of war actually is a very mistaken metaphor to use. Because there is no clear enemy, and also, what does it mean to defeat anything, right? What is the clear endpoint? In a war, there can be a victory or not, even though there can be long-term repercussions. But in this case, I think we're dealing with a situation where there is no finite endpoint. And the idea of the metaphor of the war really is therefore quite imperfect for the situation that we're facing. And I think a far better way of thinking about this is to think about the virus as part of an ecology, right? A natural living ecosystem that we need to therefore deal with as a part of nature, and in which we therefore have to find more natural based responses. I think there are two levels at which the nature is playing out here. The first is a kind of biological interdependence amongst all of us, and I think Daria alluded to a great deal of that when she talked about the system level proportions and the fact that we are entering this problem and have to find solutions that are much more collective, much more integrated than before. And that, I think, comes from the fact that we're dealing with a deeply complex and adaptive problem here. Not a technical problem like a war, but a complex and adaptive human living system where we need to find human and living solutions. But more important than the biological interdependence, I would say, is the moral interdependence that we've also seen highlighted by the crisis. And what I mean by that is the fact that all of us are in relationships with one another. And the crisis has really brought that out. The fact that countries are not safe if anybody decides to move out of quarantine situations or not think about the community, right? Individualistic tendencies, I think, have been shown to be deeply problematic at this time. And what we need, therefore, is a much better sense of these moral relationships and the moral connections that we have with others. I think this is particularly strong when we realize that in most societies, those most affected by the crisis have been the weakest and the most vulnerable, right? Whether you define that by socioeconomic status or power access or access to resources. And the more we realize that we have this moral interdependence, that those of us who are blessed with good situations must try and help those who do not, then I think the more we'll be able to actually respond to the complexity, both in moral and physical terms, of the crisis that we're facing. The last thought that I thought I would share very briefly is the fact that we need to think about new ways of operating if we are going to survive and indeed thrive in a world where potentially COVID is going to be endemic. I fully agree with Daria, right? We need to prepare, right, and not just react to what's going on. I think we have a tendency when we analyze the future to try and predict it. And that is, to me, a mistaken way of approaching it, because actually predicting the future is not useful. What is useful is using ideas about the future in order to make better decisions today. And of course, the challenge with today is that we can't even plan anymore. And in order to prepare well, actually, I think we need to really learn how to learn again. We have to allow ourselves to be in this space, learn from the data that's being thrown at us, unlearn certain old assumptions that have proven to be limiting or flawed, and find new ways of operating. And the sooner we can move into that learning mindset rather than a pure doing mindset or action-based mindset, the sooner I think we will learn to thrive in the new circumstances that we're in. I'll stop there for now and see where the conversation takes us. Thanks, Marco.
Great, thanks, Aaron, and thanks for unveiling a really rich discussion about the interdependencies that this crisis has revealed and the need for new operative procedures and systems to tackle the scale of the problems that we're facing. And I'm turning to Olli-Pekka for his own observations and whether that resonate with him, and more broadly sort of point to as an introduction to the situation in Finland.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you very much for having this chance of being part of the panel with Aaron and Daria. And I very much agree what I've heard so far, them telling about how they see the situation. To me, the pandemic has kind of made it visible that there are kind of two competing worldviews. There's the worldview that in which kind of was the main worldview when our societal structures, organization, management models were created. And that's the world where we kind of thought that we have the control. And that was clearly also the kind of expectation for the political decision making and the public service, that you have the right answers, that's your duty, and you also have to do the planning, you have to do the budgeting, and you must then act so that you reach those plans and budget targets. And that's a world where you kind of think that you know the future. And although it kind of sounds funny today, it's still the way that our culture is. And the other worldview is the worldview where you have to face the facts of uncertainty, that we do not have the right answers. And of course, the COVID-19 has been the kind of teacher for us in that sense, that nobody knew when it started what it is about. There were so many open questions that we tried to learn from each other what to do, how to react, what's the best way to go forward, and so on. And where do we get the evidence? And that kind of leads to another type of a worldview where actually learning is essential. Your ability to learn, the speed of learning. And by learning, I do not mean the idea that you kind of create somewhere a best practice and then you kind of learn what that is and implement it. But what I mean is emergent learning, that what is best constantly keeps changing and you have to keep up with it. So as we, for example, in the public sector, we have so much talked about the performance management, but actually we should move from that to capacity management, to increasing the capacity and the learning capacity of different public organizations to learn from one another. And that leads us also to the kind of system portfolio approach, that we should have kind of different interventions connected to each other and constantly learning from each other. And that's an entirely different worldview, but that's kind of the transformational challenge that we are faced with in today's situation.
You're on mute, Marco.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So that's very interesting, and it really ties in well with what is my next questions, that we always have the impression that governments are in search of a lighthouse. There's someone or something that can illuminate them on the where to go. And you made very explicitly that sometimes this evidence is not there. But how do we get beyond the need to have a predefined script or a body of evidence or a pioneer that to follow when uncertainty is high? What is your experience? What is your recipe for how to move forwards in this context? Perhaps I'll start with Aaron this time.
Sure, Marco. That's a great question. I actually think that the image of the lighthouse is a useful one. There are some things that we should be centered by and in a sense, use as our anchor. And these are things like the vision of where we would like to go. What do we want to become, right, as organizations and as entities, or even as countries? And also the values, right? What are the things that define us? The things that if we deviate from them, we cease to be, right? What are the core values that exist? Those things I think should be lighthouses and should guide what we do, precisely because as things change, right, as uncertainty envelops us and becomes more pervasive, we need those sorts of anchoring principles. What I think we shouldn't be anchored by is specific worldviews about how things are going to shape up, right? Olli-Pekka used the word worldview, I think. And what we need to is not to be beholden to particular assumptions or mental models about the world. And the way in which we can overcome those artificial lighthouses, if you like, is by saying, by asking ourselves to consider and contemplate different versions of the future. When Daria talked about scenario planning, I think that's really what she's asking us to do, right? Tell ourselves stories about the future that actually go against what we deeply believe is going to happen, so that we question ourselves and ask ourselves, are we making the right assumptions here? Do we need to update our priors, and do we need to look at the world in new ways? I think this is particularly important because if we get our assumptions wrong, then that's when we can actually move into quite swampy, murky kind of territory. And I think, therefore, it's in those sorts of cases that these artificial sources of stability end up becoming more problematic than they do provide solutions. I'll give you a specific example, right? I mean, many countries, I think, function on the basis of growth being a useful thing, right? Economic growth being useful. And that is predicated on some fairly capitalistic assumptions about the world, right? We assume that more growth is better and that growth is nearly always going to be a good thing. But once we start to question that, once we realize that actually lots of growth may be poorly distributed, that growth may actually engender certain externalities that are negative and actually more harmful for society than they produce gains. Those sorts of things help us to question that assumption and to say, well, actually, maybe we need a much more well-distributed economic system. Maybe we need to have a system that takes into account social costs and not just private costs. And that's a very simple example, but it's one that I think is helpful to remind us that any assumption we make is one that we need to question very, very deeply. Particularly because sometimes when we come up with scenarios, right, we tell ourselves, oh, it's difficult to envision the future because there's so many unthinkables out there. We make this a cognitive problem, right, and assume that if we cannot think about the future, it must be because something is wrong analytically. and that it's difficult for us to do because we don't have the cognitive apparatus to do the work. But actually, when we say that a future isn't going to happen, what we mean is not that it's unthinkable, but that it is unpalatable, that it is difficult for us to accept, that we don't like it, and therefore we ignore the future. And then we come up with all sorts of reasons cognitively to reverse justify why that might be the case. And I think that's really damaging, because just because we're afraid of something, because something is out there lurking in the dark sides of a dysfunction, doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with it. It's precisely those sorts of issues that actually do need to be dealt with, because if we don't, they have a danger of being really explosive in how they emerge eventually.
Thanks, Aaron. You make a very important point about not locking the future and sort of thinking and contemplating different version of it. Now, Finland is one of those countries that have one of the most sophisticated discussion about the future at all levels. And we know that Finnish ministries have access to future reviews before elections, so that they can inform the policy discussion at a very high level. Olli-Pekka, how has this played out in Finland, and what is the reality about making sort of multiple futures still possible and embedding them into a debate at senior government level?
Yes, thank you. It is very true that we have actually already a long tradition about future work in government, in parliament, in public sector in general. And I would say that it has helped us during the pandemic, that the idea of utilizing the future, kind of building different scenarios, and then kind of helping that to make decisions today has been visible in Finland. What we are kind of seeing as what is our next step in this is the fact that how we can still in a stronger way bring this kind of future approach, this kind of anticipatory governance, innovation governance to the main processes of government and the parliament. So still in Finland, it's sometimes a kind of a separate process, and we need to integrate it more strongly to the kind of main political discussion and decision making.
And Daria, picking on that, what is leaders in your position that have the responsibility of stewarding a portfolio of projects under an entire agency do when they need to set up a real anticipatory government? What are the steps that you have taken in that directions concretely, and how hard or easy was it to kickstart?
Well, first of all, as a government agency, we can do a lot as the innovation agency, but in government, as we heard from the Finnish experiment, there is still work to be done. And I just want to be clear that I don't have that level of mandate. But let's put it this way, that it is very valuable to have processes where government is together with actors, look at joint missions, what do we need to achieve, but also explore various scenarios. We need to be able to do that not in a prescriptive way, as we heard, but rather through a culture of experimentation and learning. And there have shared portfolios. And I think that there are some really interesting efforts within Climate Kick. I see them in Sweden, I see them in Netherlands, Finland, etc. So that also comes back to then thinking about what data actually to follow. Because Aaron, you mentioned that we're dealing with now complex adaptive systems. And to be honest, the way we handle data typically to build evidence isn't really adjusted to that. It's something else to try to in real time follow, movements within a complex adaptive system. So I think that we also need to acknowledge and learn from each other, and also actually invest in that kind of ability together, because there is much to be done in improving the speed in which we can see that portfolio and see how various part of a system is moving, because the type of levers that will make change happen will depend on the kind of probabilities within parts of a complex system. So we're not there yet, but I think we're beginning to learn. And then there are some abilities that governments actually do have to have in their toolbox. And we have seen such as risk-managed regulatory explorative work. So you can call it sandboxes, you can do it in various ways. We've seen governments do that, but it's a really important quality in that we need that to be allowed. So I guess that's a few reflections. But on an average, I would just like to say that we say that, it does take courage to lead. And what I'm hoping for is that we also agree that the focus needs to be on the regeneration of our economy and society. And there is an important discussion, and I appreciate, for instance, Mariana Mazzucato's work on that in discussing what do we mean when we define value? Because apart from this, we're not coming to a new normal. I think that we also need to have some serious discussions about value, because the way that we structure that, not least in government, has a huge impact on our ability to move forward.
Great, thanks, Daria. Let me get back to that point in a second. In the meantime, I'm start seeing sort of the results of the poll questions about the role that government should take in facing uncertainty. And there is an astoundingly 78% of the responses that says, bluntly, my government should be in the lead role, actively embracing and shaping uncertainties. What does this answer there's this direction of this answer surprise you at all? Or what do you think would be the 1-2 things that individuals in government could start doing to really make this real and start embracing uncertainty? And I'll leave it open who wants to pick on these questions first from the results of our poll.
I can start, Olli-Pekka here. Well, I read the result a bit to kind of forward leaning, and well, that's probably the kind of tells more about the audience that we are having, and that's very good. But I think that the things that kind of individual kind of people in the civil service, they can do. Of course, there's the thing of kind of experimenting that we already talked about, to kind of act, probe, and see that what happens, and to kind of learn from that. That's kind of one issue. The other issue, which I see very important, is that as we're talking about systems, then what to me is very important is relationships. Relationships between different actors, of course, the whole of government approach, but also between different layers of the governance, and also public, private, and the civil society parts. And then there is the issue that how can we kind of create trust in those relationships? And to me, kind of trust consists of 3 parts. It's the credibility that you have the ability to act. Then it's the reliability that you keep what you say that you're doing. And the third one is actually intimacy, the closeness that you understand each other's viewpoints. And that's a kind of a big issue, that how to have that kind of a dialogues between different actors. And those are actually the learning processes, to have that kind of multi-perspective kind of ability to look at how we could do things better.
Thanks, Olli-Pekka. Daria and Aaron, do you want to add on this?
I don't mind jumping in here, because I actually think there's a direct line connecting the survey results you mentioned, and Daria mentioned Mariana Mazzucato's work, right, around the entrepreneurial state, because Mariana's work is really all about saying that states should feel empowered, and they can actually make a power of difference in public outcomes when they lead investment, right, and they play this strong facilitative role in actually making decisions around investment and figuring out where exactly public energy is going to be focused. So I think there's a sense of agency in what Mariana says the state should have, and what we are seeing in our survey results. I agree with Olli-Pekka. I think this says a lot about our audience, is that they believe the state should have that agency even if not all states actually do exercise that agency in the best possible way. I think the really interesting question is to ask ourselves, if we expect governments to play that sort of leadership role, what does that look like in a world where we're dealing with complexity, where we're dealing with interdependence, and where the simplistic command structures of hierarchies that Olli-Pekka talked about, right, the illusions of control are not there anymore. What does the state do, and how does the state exercise its agency in a world where this sort of hierarchy is elusive? And I can think of a few ways, right? One is, I agree with Olli-Pekka that we need governments to think across themselves, right? So to think about cross-agency coordination, whole of government thinking, very joined up kind of work. But more important, even more than that, I think you need whole of nation coordination. The government needs to be doing facilitative work that brings together multiple sectors, multiple actors from the private and community sectors in order to achieve some of these outcomes, because we cannot function alone. None of us is responding to the pandemic by ourselves, right? And we find that with most complex problems, whether it's demographics or climate change, we need to harness the potential of businesses and of community players and of individual active citizens. So I think that becomes quite key. And it means that the role of the state actually in playing that leadership function is not just the role of regulator or the role of provider of order, which were the very traditional things that governments used to do. Governments still have to do some of that, but I think increasingly governments have to play the role of ecosystem stewards. They need to take care of current ecosystems in trust for the future. They need to be facilitators of multiple interests. They need to convene different parties so that they can actually have conversations with each other. And they need to aggregate some of those interests. If you like, governments need to become platforms of their own, right? The same way our iPhones and laptops are platforms. And the more governments embrace that platform role, then the stronger I think they can be in actually exercising the kind of agency that the survey results would like us to.
And I'd love to draw on that, because I completely agree, and I very much appreciate my visits in Singapore, because I think so coming back to your point, Olli-Pekka, on the quality in the relations that we need, regardless if we talk about a whole of government approach or enabling actually the ecosystem, and that has to do with the qualities in how these relationships are formed in terms of how we actually interact. And I'd like to just point out, I mean, to be very concrete, the parts of society that have the longest been living in a fast-moving context have already developed principles on what is required. And the principle that we've already touched on is having shared visions and ideas of what, you know, what will the future look like, but not being prescriptive in how to get there. But there's also like real qualities in the processes. So I think for governments, for instance, just, you know, what does the facilitation of the dialogue with the citizens and the industry actors, etc., actually look like? What kind of tools are being used there to materialize the ideas, to prototype, to actually create this kind of engagement? And those professions do exist. And we have resources to draw on in transdisciplinary research, in design thinking methodology. And it's just as for any organization, in order to be adaptive to uncertainties, and we've seen that traditionally in tech industries, etc., those professional, the knowledge of how to do that and the qualities in these are in there, and they need to be core to the way that government work as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Daria. One thing that triggers is that involves also a change in the skin of the game for many civil servants that are working in the public sector. So I think, and I'm picking on one of the questions from the audience that asks how we can make the very significant shift from performance management to capacity management, and how we can build this sort of the civil service of the future that has the skills to lead this change at very, very many different levels, not just on the leadership side, but also on those that are asked to put down and use the tools that you mentioned very concretely. So how can this change happen? Perhaps I'll pick on Olli-Pekka first.
Yes, thank you. Well, as any other change, I think the best way to do it is to find out, to try it, and see what are the kind of outcomes of that kind of an approach? And I would be kind of ready to make a bet that coming out from the kind of still having often a kind of a hierarchical kind of a role there of performance management, moving that to a capacity management will mean that the outcomes will be better. Why? Because the hierarchy actually hinders learning. There's a fear issue with that kind of a hierarchy that kind of makes it difficult for an organization to adapt to the reality around it and the circumstances that constantly change. But when you are kind of trying to make sure that that organization has the capacity, then you are encouraging them to learn new things and constantly develop. And I think that's quite simple. And the question is to just go for it.
Right, Daria, do you want to add on this wisdom?
Yeah, but I think it's an important. It sounds simple, but it's super important. As a leader, be sure to lead in a way that celebrates learning. Even the language of failure, I would argue against. You can make risk-managed experiments, but most of all, and actually, as we know in the innovation system, even a negative result is a valuable result. The learning is essential. So I agree about that. The other thing that has been touched on, and I want to emphasize further, is to do this with the ecosystem approach already from the beginning. So it's not a government trying to change itself. It's something that needs to be done from the beginning by doing things together with civil society, with industry, with startups. And the good news is, I think that there's a lot to draw on already. If I look into the ecosystem, for instance, in Sweden, a lot has happened just in the past couple of years in the ability for instance, multinational industrial leaders to co-create together with academia and small startups, etc. So many of the principles that we're now discussing are already shared with a large part of the ecosystem, and looking at how to then enable these capabilities. Actually, I would love to highlight that I think that Singapore has a very interesting approach, and just you can comment on that further, but just thinking in terms of what are the types of work practices and kind of professional capabilities that we need, and how can we build platforms for that, and what kind of train the trainer setups can we create to, when we do this in the ecosystem together with the actors, at the same time train civil servants as well as other type, it's similar capabilities in the other parts of the system. So we can do that at the same time.
Aaron, over to you.
Yeah, it's such a rich question, Marco. And I was trying to tease out in my head what exactly is the difference between performance and capacity. Because actually, if you build capacity, performance will happen as well, right? So they're not quite mutually exclusive, but they are. You're right that if you focus too much on performance, then you stop thinking about the broader issue of capacity. And I was trying to jotting down ideas here of the mindset shifts that are necessary in order for us to focus on that broader system stewardship and capacity mindset that is needed. And it strikes me that we probably need 7 things, to happen for real focus on capacity. First is, instead of optimization, which suggests a certain, fixed way of viewing the world, right? Where you have a single way of optimizing things. You need to move into a resilience mindset where you may not actually pare every resource down to its bare minimum, but you actually have a certain amount of ramp up capacity or spillover capacity in an overall systemic approach. The second is that I think we need to move away from pure quantitative indicators of success to qualitative ones. And Daria, I think you alluded to this earlier, right? In the kind of the focus on even on design thinking, right? When you hear ethnographic stories, that's listening to the qualitative data and not just the quantitative. The third is, I think we need to move from a pure focus on output to outcomes, and that actually helps us to end up focusing on capacity much more. I think we need, fourth, to move from linear approaches to more exponential approaches to realize that when you think about capacity in a system level, then actually a single unit of additional input can have really quite profound nonlinear effects in an exponential way on overall outcomes. The fifth is that we need to move from scarcity mindsets to abundance mindsets, or if you like, from fixed mindsets to growth mindsets, because we have to allow ourselves the fact that we will learn and we can change and improve in response to feedback and coaching, and we get better, right, over time. Systems can get better just as individuals can get better. And I think that the kind of work that Carol Dweck is doing in Stanford, right, on growth mindsets and not just fixed mindsets, is a really key part where we're managing not just performance, but of capacity as well. Last two things, we need to move from stable, equilibrium-focused work to more iterative work, where we say we might not get things right immediately, but we can keep adjusting and experimenting and getting things better in a prototype sort of way. And over time, have a sustained series of improvements. And then the last thing I would say, number 7, is we need to move from a very silo mindset, because performance can be of very narrow sections of a subsystem to integration. We need to allow for the fact that sometimes some local level sub-optimization actually allows us to do much better at the global level. And I think if we put all those things together, then we actually end up with a much more capacity-focused approach to things, rather than one that is narrowly focused on very specific measures of performance.
Great, thanks a lot. It's really rich view on how we can move from a controlling to a facilitating state that has completely different features built in. I just want to go back a second to a question related to change and the risk of change. Often we consider that taking actions in the middle of uncertainty does come with a certain amount of risk, and the actions that are associated to that may damage the legitimacy and trust in government. Do you have in mind an example in which government are trying to manage this balancing act and between sort of keeping trust, but also having to take very serious risk and actions that you don't know the result of? And how hard is it to take this decision? Olli-Pekka, perhaps?
Yes, thank you. It's a tricky question, and I would say that well, for example, here in Finland, I felt that it was very courageous that during the springtime and during the summertime of the pandemic, that our Prime Minister, she has been saying that we will be kind of making new decisions and maybe changing our position as we get new evidence. And I think that's a very effective way of doing it, kind of saying it out loud, that evidence has an effect on how we decide. And trust does not mean that that something that you once say, you have to stick to that to the rest of the world. There's a Finnish joke about Finnish couples that when they get married, they on the marriage day, they say to each other that I love you, and if there's no change in circumstances, you don't have to repeat it. And that's the kind of the old way of seeing trust, that it's kind of change, it doesn't change. And now when the circumstances are changing all the time, we have to be able to also kind of be able to have different views as we learn. That's kind of learning as it is. So the kind of mental approach is humble and decisive.
Thanks, Olli-Pekka. Aaron, Daria?
I can dive in. So I agree very much about that. And we've seen similar leadership in Sweden. And I think it's, it's a mindset and the leadership where we also have to, acknowledge to the political leaders that all of the population might not appreciate it, but it's the approach that we need, and I think that it will in the long run also pay off. Another thing I'd like to reflect on is that when we then act on when government takes risk in terms of financial risk, for instance, in the trace of the pandemic, making really an effort to make sure that these risks are with a regenerative approach. So taking the chance of shaping the future, not only reacting. And I think that there have been a few examples in different countries then also in addressing at the same time, if this pays off, not only risk sharing for making that effort in terms of pulling in taxpayers' money, unloading risk, etc., to save jobs or whatever, but actually making sure that if this fares well, or at the same time making requirements then, okay, rewarding those who are moving towards the direction that we do need, and at the same time also thinking about the citizen perspective of value sharing for efforts that have a high risk but that may actually pay off. And I think that there are some good examples both of when such opportunities have been lost, but also when opportunities have been there, and that has to do with anything from citizen dividends to kind of requirements for using taxpayers' money to support industries and companies in various ways. So I think that there are many such examples happening right now.
This point on leadership is an interesting one, Marco, because what we're asking of our leaders actually in worlds of shock and flux and uncertainty is actually a significant set of skills. I like to think of it as leaders having to balance kind of different tensions, different trade-offs, different polarities, if you like. So it's not either or kind of thinking, but really trying to embrace both, right? You have to be firmly rooted in the present, but thinking about the future all the time. You've got to keep the very micro in mind because that's who you're affecting in terms of individual citizens, but you've got to keep the macro in mind in terms of the overall system stewardship as well. You have to keep the here and now. You've got to keep the long term in mind. You sometimes have to slow things down. Sometimes you have to speed things up. And I think that kind of polarity-based thinking is probably the most important quality, right? Because it allows the leader to toggle between different apparently competing priorities. But actually, when you think about it from a slightly bigger perspective across time, we start to see that these are not contradictory. They're actually mutually quite reinforcing. I always go back to this line from a short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald, the same author as of The Great Gatsby. And he writes in this short story, The Crack Up, that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold opposing thoughts in the head and continue to function. So I think that's what we need of our leaders, right? In government, but also in businesses and in civil society. We need people who can hold opposing thoughts in their head and continue to function while they live out the extremes of those polarities.
That's very good. I'm looking at connecting with some questions that are now being asked in the panel. There's one that is, I think it's really relevant, and it really goes about the core of it. And the question is, how can we help citizens sort of trust government as they take on experiment that basically prepare for very uncertain future rather than on a sort of a false clarity or false certainty? Is there a role for government to be sort of educate also citizens on the risk and possibilities that are inherently linked with managing those experiments? And if there is a role, what would it be?
I'm happy to start on this one, just so we keep the little rotation going. I believe quite firmly in a principle from organizational development, right? So people who are interested in things like team dynamics and organizational energy dynamics. The idea here is that people buy into what they help create. People trust things when they are involved in the creation of them. So if I tell someone, this is the rule, please obey it, unless they're a 3-year-old, they're probably not going to like that very much. Even the 3-year-old is probably not going to like that very much when you think about it, right? Whereas if you co-create with people, right, and if you say you are involved in the creation of these principles and these norms and these policies, I think they're much more likely to be not just defenders of it, but people who will actually believe in the quality of it. So this, I think, is an argument for, again, government as facilitator, right? To use the image that I talked about earlier, government as convener of bringing different interests together and then having those conversations actually happen. I think this is an argument for participatory government, not populist government, right, where the government simply gives people what they want, but a participatory government that says, here are the problems we are facing. None of us by ourselves are able to come up with the full solution to them. We therefore need to deliberate. We need to bring our different ideas together and find some kind of, not middle ground, but a way of combining and synthesizing the different ideas such that the whole becomes far greater than the sum of the parts. So I think involving people is probably the most key thing, whether that's in a small team or a large scale national exercise. The more people are involved, the more they will buy into what they've helped create.
Daria, I see that your little finger up. Does this co-creation work in Sweden? How do you relate?
Absolutely. I mean, well, since this is a very human thing, to what Aaron pointed out in terms of what you helped create is something that you engage in, believe in, and will make happen. So obviously, I'd like to say that one of the things that is kind of inspirational and encouraging to see then is how this translates into place-based processes in terms of the important role of cities in this transformation. So again, there are multiple examples from cities all over the world where this type of co-creation in terms of co-created priorities, visions, prototypes, and actual which bring about results that are tangible in the very same environment have proven to be quite effective. And they will also be crucial because many of the transformations we talk about now, regardless if it has to do with our food system or our mobility system, will kind of come together in the cities where we live. So just pointing out that there is a valuable work. But then what typically happens in the way that we have worked previously is that that's the local level. National government isn't really there. So again, we have to kind of connect through the layers then and make this be efforts that connect through the national and the local and also the international efforts. So there's a lot that we can do there.
If I can continue from that, I totally agree with Daria about the cities. There's a lot of interesting things happening in cities, and I think they have the closeness, the intimacy also to those concrete issues, and the kind of capacity to kind of enable and facilitate that kind of discussions and kind of being part of the decision making. We've had some experiments in Finland about kind of deliberative dialogues, and the experience has been that actually citizens can kind of take part and share their views on very kind of complex issues. That I think that is something also that we quite often kind of underestimate the ability of citizens to involve in this kind of dialogues. And another thing that I wanted to take up is, of course, again, back to the learning issue, that the big issues that we are faced with, as we have talked, whether talking about kind of climate change or inequality or other things, actually what is needed is that we're talking about that people should behave differently. And how do you make that happen? I think there are kind of three ways of doing it. The traditional ones are kind of you use power, authority, legislation, or the other one is the kind of the rational way that you tell people that you should do this and that they are so rational that they understand that of course they're going to change their behavior. But they are quite often actually these two quite ineffective ways of doing change. They are needed in the future, of course, but I think we need a third model, and that's learning. That's the kind of way to create by experience for citizens their own experience of seeing that things could be done differently and that could have different outcomes. And then we're talking about the kind of internal motivation and the change happening through that. And there I would say that we should pay special attention to the most vulnerable people, because quite often we are actually talking about their changes and the kind of the challenges in their lives, that they have a voice when these problems are dealt with. And as there is this kind of idea that let's not lose a good kind of crisis, that may also divide people. And we have to make sure that we involve those people who are kind of being in the chains is more demanding than others.
Thanks a lot, Olli-Pekka. And this has been really a rich discussion with many different threads, and can also testify by the many questions that are coming to us. And we're getting to an end, and I have to ask you a final question that is the same for all the speakers across this event, and that we hopefully help shape our call to action after this. So the question is, what are you personally committed to doing differently in light of what has been revealed by this crisis? Perhaps Aaron first?
I am most committed, I think, to trying to think through the differential effects of anything that happens, right? Whether it's a pandemic or the policies that come in response. I think what the pandemic's really highlighted, and I alluded to this in my introductory remarks as well, right, is that effects are felt in variegated, unequal, differentiated ways. People talk about K-shaped recoveries, right? The fact that some of us are going to be far better off from COVID and some will be far worse off. I think, like I said, our least, last, and lost, right? The most vulnerable amongst us are often the ones who bear the brunt and burdens of these challenges. And I'm getting increasingly committed, therefore, to asking myself, whenever I have one idea, how might it be felt differently amongst different communities? What are the relevant archetypes at work here? Who are the key protagonists in response? And how do we take account of those very, very different effects? Then I think we start to make policy in a richer way that allows us to deal with the very human consequences that the policy can have, rather than assuming that the policy takes place in a very neat and uniform sort of manifestation. That would be my major commitment. Yeah, thanks.
Well, if I'm next in line, I guess that's what I wanted to make clear. And I think in this context, it's perhaps not as needed, but I do notice, regardless if we're looking at investors' perspectives, industrial, etc., being part of the voices that create the sense of urgency. This is really not. The deadline is planetary deadlines. They're hard. So I think that sense of urgency makes you reevaluate risks. We need to talk about the very real risks. And that's, of course, but then as the Director General of the Innovation Agency, I'm committed to supporting our government and our actors in building the quality in these relationships and in the capabilities for co-creating this future. And that's something we can only do together with government, together with the actors. And I'm very, very happy that I can see that there is a lot of learning going on, for instance, in this type of context as well. So making sure that we invest our time and talent into exactly that learning. It requires a lot also in our own organization, of course.
My commitment comes from the learning of the sector I'm responsible of at the moment, education, and the period of distance learning that we went through during the spring months. And the learning was that when there was a functioning relationship and discussion and dialogue before the pandemic started between the family and the school, everything went smoothly during the distance learning period when children were studying at home. But if there wasn't that kind of a functioning relationship, each other kind of knowing that what the school is about, that how it sees its role, and what are the pedagogical solutions, then there was usually some kind of friction on the way. And that the learning is that we need to concentrate on building the relations and the quality of the relationships, because the important things happen not by individual actors, but in the relationship that they have with each other.
That's just great ending. I retain 3 keywords: the ability to learn, the sense of building a sense of urgency for actions, and also shaping quality relations across the board between those that serves and those that are served. Thank you very much for your participation in this panel. Thank you, the audience, for following us, and again, for accepting our invitation to be part of this. And the Government Aftershock continues with more sessions in this afternoon. Again, thank you and good afternoon to all of you.